You watch someone else make a painful public mistake, and you quietly take notes so you never end up in their shoes. I'm Name A, and this is Name B. And this right here is a record of the rules that governed global politics for decades. Recently, the United States escalated its military strikes against targets in Iran. Under Donald Trump's administration, the U.S. demonstrated a willingness to use lethal force against top-tier foreign leadership. But the most attentive player in this conflict didn't fire a single shot. China has been quietly observing every move, gathering data on how the U.S. handles a crisis, with their eyes fixed squarely on the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese military has formally published 5 specific conclusions from these strikes. These aren't guesses. They are the documented data points the People's Liberation Army is using to adjust its own combat readiness for the future. The first old rule used to be trust your inner circle and integrate with global technology. That rule has been replaced by an era of extreme internal scrutiny. During the early days of the conflict, U.S. and Israeli intelligence eliminated highly protected Iranian leadership. They knew exactly where top figures like Ayatollah Ali Khamenei were meeting because they had deeply embedded local operatives who understood the language and the culture. Beijing watched that and immediately looked inward. Over the last several months, the Chinese military has conducted massive purges of its own top-tier leadership. When the CIA openly releases videos to recruit Chinese officers, Beijing assumes the threat is already inside the house. This caution is playing out directly in Taiwan, where espionage prosecutions spiked from just 16 cases in 2021 to 64 in 2024. Beijing is operating on the belief that any internal crack will be exploited immediately. It extends to hardware, too. During the strikes, the United States jammed Iran's GPS signals. GPS is the U.S.-controlled global positioning system that provides location and timing data to everything from smartphones to missiles. China, however, has built a countermeasure. Their proprietary Beidou satellite network continued functioning perfectly during the interference, proving they no longer rely on American signals to guide their precision weapons. But Beijing also found a glaring weakness in their own military exports. Reports indicate that Chinese-made HQ-9B radar systems sold to Iran failed to detect incoming U.S. F-22 and F-35 fighter jets and were destroyed in the opening hour of the attacks. For Beijing, watching their own hardware fail in live combat has accelerated the shift toward total technological self-reliance. In this environment, a single foreign microchip or an unvetted officer is viewed as a point of failure that could collapse an entire operation. The next old rule: the diplomatic negotiation table guarantees your safety. Recent events suggest otherwise. The U.S. launched its military strikes against Iran at the exact same time the two nations were actively engaged in peace negotiations, setting a precedent that talking does not mean the bombs have stopped. We saw this pattern in South America as well. Washington was in active talks with Venezuela's government right up until American special forces raided Caracas and arrested President Nicolas Maduro. From Beijing's perspective, international rules of engagement have become secondary to the will of the stronger power. They expect opponents to strike without warning, regardless of diplomatic status. To prepare for that reality, China just increased its defense budget by 7%. They are aggressively expanding their naval fleet and nuclear-powered carriers to build what leadership calls a Great Wall of Steel. Beijing no longer believes safety comes from treaties. They are convinced the only way to prevent an attack is to possess military power so overwhelming that the cost of intervention becomes too high for any adversary to pay. But does possessing the biggest army automatically guarantee a strategic win? The U.S. destroyed its targets in Iran, but the region didn't stabilize. Instead, the conflict began pulling in neighboring nations like Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, creating a wider crisis. China looks at that spreading fire and thinks about Taiwan. They want a clean unification, not a decades-long insurgency that draws in the Philippines or Japan and triggers a global economic meltdown. Winning the initial bombing campaign is the easy part. Beijing's real fear is being trapped in a geopolitical nightmare where the initial victory leads to a permanent, unmanageable occupation. This chart shows the projected inventory of advanced U.S. munitions. The U.S. war machine burns through precision missiles faster than factories can replenish them. Emptying magazines in the Middle East means lacking the immediate reserves required to sustain a second intervention in the Pacific. Then there's the political side. China sees a deeply divided American political system. When domestic support for a war is low and costs are rising, keeping a democratic government committed to a long-distance conflict becomes a major challenge. In contrast, Beijing relies on a centralized system. Leadership believes this structure gives them the stamina to endure short-term economic pain to achieve strategic goals that may take decades to realize. Beijing is calculating that U.S. intervention depends less on total military size and more on the political stamina of a divided Washington. These observations are already dictating how China will posture itself in the Pacific for the next decade. The strategies that governed the last 30 years are being replaced by a doctrine that prioritizes self-sufficiency and overwhelming local force. Let us know in the comments which part of this strategic shift you find most significant, and subscribe to Global Lens for more deep dives into the changing map of global power.